All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to attend today's talk. And before introducing today's talk, I'd just like to first talk a bit about some of our upcoming talks, and then I will hand it over to my co-host, Melinda, who will then introduce Ms. McEvoy. So on October 18th, we're proud to present Dr. Mark Esposito, who will talk about the implications of AI for society, governments, and the future of work. He is a business professor, a best-selling author, entrepreneur, and senior advisor to governments. He was inducted in 2016 in the radar of Thinkers 50 as one of the 30 most prominent rising business thinkers in the world. On October 31st, we will have Professor Mashiv Vardi, who will discuss the interrelationship between humans, machines, and work. Professor Vardi is a renowned mathematician and computer scientist, and a member of the National Academy of Engineering, National Academy of Sciences, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the European Academy of Sciences, and the Academia Europae. And finally, on November 7th, Dr. Xiaodong Huang will share Microsoft's AI journey to help everyone and every organization on the planet achieve more and communicate better. He'll share AI tools and projects that he's been working on, Microsoft's vision for AI, and what skill set Microsoft expects for its future employees who are interested in working in the AI field. Dr. Huang is a Microsoft Technical Fellow and the CTO of AI Cognitive Services. And in 2016, he was named one of 25 geniuses who are creating the future of business by Wired magazine. Free registration for these 3 talks are open now, and you're welcome to register and join all of these talks. Please help spread the word so more people can learn about AI and its impacts. I'll now turn it over to my co-host, Melinda Xu, who I will now let her introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Melinda Xu, and I am one of the team members of Youth AI Lab and the co-host for today's event. I'm a 9th grader currently attending Head Rice from Oakland, California. I'm passionate about exploring AI and ML advancements and the application of AI in a way where it can be used to benefit and not harm our society. Before I introduce Fiona, I'd like to briefly go over the logistics of the talk. Since we have an audience watching from our YouTube live stream as well as from Zoom, we'll be doing a Q&A through a platform called Slido. Either go to the URL I've provided in the chat or go to Slido and enter event code 90792. Feel free to submit questions throughout the talk, but we'll only be answering questions in a Q&A session at the end of Fiona's talk, so I encourage you to stick around till the very end. As the generation driving the rise of AI, it's extremely important to discuss how we can responsibly use AI in a way where we can avoid the worst case scenarios. So with that, now let me introduce today's speaker, Fiona McEvoy. We are very grateful to have her here today to discuss today's topic at hand. Fiona is an AI ethics writer, researcher, speaker, and thought leader based in San Francisco, California. She was named one of the 30 women influencing AI in San Francisco by Rework and one of the 100 Billion Women in AI Ethics 2020 and 2019 by Lighthouse 3. Fiona is the founder of YouTheData.com and has had numerous articles published in media outlets, including Slate, VentureBeat, The Next Web, Offscreen, All Turtles, Chatbots Live, and Becoming Human. She's also regularly asked to present her ideas to AI conferences across the US and internationally. Today, Fiona will present some of the ethical concerns surrounding emerging tech, including bias, surveillance, and AI-driven deception. Let's give a warm welcome to Fiona.
Hello, I'm just going to share my screen. It's a delight to be here. Hopefully this will work. So can we see that?
Yeah, looks good.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. As I say, I'm delighted to be here today to talk about the ethical impact of AI and new and emerging technologies. As Melinda pointed out, I'm a writer. I do a little bit of research and I speak as well, and a little bit of consultancy. And mostly I spend a lot of time thinking about this. How technology is changing the human experience. We're all living through really an incredible time when it comes to technology. New and emerging technologies are changing the way that we live. They're changing the way that we interact. They're changing education. They're changing, for those of us that have jobs, they're changing the way that we work and indeed work from home. And it's really important to get ahead of it, to make sure that we can anticipate and negate any of the negative consequences of the development of AI. And that's what I spend a lot of time doing. But I'm going to start with an anecdote. And I love this story because first, it's true. And secondly, it really emphasizes how powerful and potent the technologies we're talking about can be. It's actually not a new story. It's about an experiment that was conducted in 2009 at Stanford University, which isn't too far away from where I'm sat here now in San Francisco. And it was actually some psychological experimenters and researchers who did this. And what they did was they got a class of elementary school kids, so young kids, and they put them in virtual reality headsets. And they had them watch like an avatar of themselves, so like a little mini-me, swimming with orca whales. And so they did that, they had a nice time. And then a couple of weeks later, they reconvened these kids and they said, tell us about that experience that you had. And a great number of these children recounted that experience as a real memory. And what I mean by that is they said that they had swum with orca whales. They thought that was a true thing that had happened to them in their lives in the recent past, which is astonishing, right? And I tell this story for two reasons. I think it makes 2 points. One of which is, as I said in the sort of setup, just how powerful technology can be, how potent it can be on our psychologies, and how it can sometimes represent the world in a way that it isn't truly. And the other thing which is really important, and particularly for those of you who are thinking about entering the AI space and working in research and development and engineering, is really how much power those people who create the technologies have over people like me, who are the users of those technologies, and what enormous amounts of responsibility they have. But I'm not here to trash technology. And those of us who look at AI ethics are generally speaking, and I can only speak for myself, but I believe that most of us are very pro technology and the promise of technology. And it's important to acknowledge that a world without technology is not a perfect world, and humans are incredibly imperfect. And so before I kind of dive into looking at AI, I wanted to do just a quick whistle-stop tour of some of the problems with humans, otherwise known as, why do we need technology in the first place? And what I'm going to look at is our cognitive flaws, or sometimes known as cognitive biases. So these are some of the ways in which humans frequently get it wrong. So starting with the first one, which is known as the halo effect. Some of you may have heard of this already. It was, it's a term coined by a very famous psychologist called Solomon Asch, many, many years ago now in the last century. And he did a little mini experiment where he presented these two people, Alan and Ben, and lists of their characteristics to his psychological subjects, his participants. And he asked them a very simple question. He said, who do you like best, Alan or Ben? And asked them to react intuitively and quickly. And some of you may already have an opinion on this, but most people preferred Alan. But those of you that are very observant will already have noticed something kind of important about Alan and Ben. And that is that they have completely the same characteristics. They're just presented in a different order. So why is it that some people preferred Alan and others said that they didn't like Ben they didn't like Ben as much? Well, this is what Solomon Asch called the halo effect. And it's to do with the fact that the information we receive about people and places and things tends to come at us in a kind of random sequence. And yet our first impressions shape the later information that we get. So to make that a little bit clearer, if we believe, because we find out these characteristics first, that Alan is intelligent and industrious, we're more likely to forgive the fact he can be a bit critical and stubborn, because we see those as maybe a downside of someone who's otherwise intelligent, and that's okay with us. But if we learn about Ben first, that he is envious and stubborn, we kind of don't like the fact that he's impulsive and intelligent. Those things are going to make us slightly cynical about the way he's going to behave. And this is because as humans, we tell ourselves stories because we need to see coherence. We need things to make sense. And so that is what we do when the halo effect kind of descends upon us in our daily lives. We aren't perfect. Another example of a cognitive flaw, and this is another true story, pertains to, I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of Bill Gates. And you will know that he runs a foundation with his wife, Melinda, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it's a big non-profit and they give lots of money to very good causes. And back in, I think it was 2006, so a little while ago now, they decided they wanted to put lots of money into schools. They wanted to make great schools in America. And the way that they wanted to think about this was they wanted to commission some research to find out now, what makes a good school? Because we want to know what makes a good school before we plunge nearly $2 billion into this enterprise. So they commissioned some researchers and they went out in Pennsylvania. That was the state that they chose. And they looked at more than 1,500 schools in Pennsylvania to try to understand what made the good ones good and what made the poor performers bad. And they came back and they said, we've got it. The best schools are small schools. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the other agencies that had teamed up with them, and there was a government department involved in this as well, were like, okay, that makes sense. Small schools are good schools, and I can see why that would be, because the ratio between students and teachers is lower, so they get more kind of face time with teachers, and resources can be shared amongst fewer people. And if you kind of sit and think about it, and you can do it yourself, you can think of reasons why small schools might be better, right? So they sunk the $1.7 billion into creating more small schools in America, and they broke up some big schools in order to do this. But the problem is, if they'd have looked at what makes a bad school bad, they'd have found that poor schools or underperforming schools are also smaller schools. And it's not that small schools are good or bad, it's just that they're more variable in the way that they perform. And yet, in this case, the people involved sought to tell themselves a coherent story. They thought about what made a school good, and it made sense to them, the rationalization that they made. But it wasn't really a reflection of the truth. So it's a flaw in our cognition. Lastly, and there are many more, if you're interested in the flaws of the human condition, there's a great book called Thinking Fast and Slow by a Nobel Prize winner called Daniel Kahneman, and he goes through lots and lots of these, and they are fascinating, and you can recognize them in yourself quite quickly, sadly. The last one is an experiment from the last decade, which was, it looked at judges and how judges make their decisions. So particularly around people who want to apply for bail, they want to be free. And this is a study that's conducted in Israel, and they looked at the dealings of 8 judges. And before they went into this, they knew one thing about bail hearings. They said, when people come before the courts, generally speaking, about 35% of them are set free. They're granted bail, it's approved, but most of them aren't. And so they wanted to see if this was the case with these 8 judges in Israel. And what they realized was that in the 2 hours after lunch, 65% of people were granted bail. And then as the day wore on, in the 2 hours before the next meal, the approvals went down and down and down, and fewer people were granted bail. And then they had another meal and back up to 65% again. So what does this tell us? It might tell us something about sugar and spikes and things like that, but it also tells us that tired, hungry judges probably fall back on default positions rather than making those judgments purely from their experience of the world. So this is all just to say, if we're talking about natural intelligence, human intelligence, and artificial intelligence, I'm going to argue that neither one is perfect, but very often there are circumstances, and all of these examples I've given are, it's important that we acknowledge that we make mistakes here. And so sometimes natural intelligence isn't that great. And sometimes that's why we need, or we might want to defer to artificial intelligence. And that's really fueling, I'm calling the artificial intelligence takeover. And what I mean by that is we're living in a time where we're deferring more and more things to artificial intelligence. I'm sure with this crowd, this description might not be needed, but this is literally a dictionary definition, but I thought it was, it's a useful one. So artificial intelligence can refer to a branch of computer science dealing with the simulation of intelligent behavior in computers, or it can refer to the capability of a machine to imitate intelligent human behavior, or we might argue surpass some intelligent human behaviors. And one thing I want to clarify at this juncture is when I'm talking about AI in this presentation, I'm really thinking about it in two ways. One is systems that make decisions, and on another hand, I'm talking about systems that make suggestions and guide our decisions. And so just to give a little bit more color to that, here are some of the ways that we have seen AI-driven systems become more ubiquitous. So thinking about a system that makes the decision for us, we might think about, and it's very simple, but a spam filter, which decides what emails we don't want to read for us, right? Whereas the Netflix algorithm suggests what movies or programs we might want to watch based on our viewing history. So decision-making or decision guidance. And I know I'm talking to a young crowd now, but these are now pretty ubiquitous. And before we had paper maps, guys, no blue lines or blue dots to follow, newspapers that were printed that we actually held in our hands. And I'm sure you're familiar with a landline, but everybody was reliant upon a landline. And in a very short amount of time, those things have been mostly outmoded, certainly in certain parts of the world. And as we push forward, we can expect to see bigger developments, similar types of, complete change and movement in many, many, many different domains. And interesting, actually, in the context of this talk to a younger audience, I thought it was fascinating to learn that Harvard University has had more people, I think it was last year, attend classes in 1 year via the internet than in the whole of its 383 or 84 year history combined. That's because of technology, and that is an incredible evolution. But obviously, I'm here to talk about ethics. And that's because we can't assume that the technologies that we use are neutral. They're designed by humans, and as we kind of just demonstrated, humans are deeply flawed. They're often run on data that comes from humans, and we are deeply flawed. And in many cases, and certainly some of the cases that I'm going to give examples of, it's deployed by humans, and we are not perfect. That's what I've spent the first part of this talk kind of talking about. And so we can easily anticipate, and there's a whole new disciplines now arising around the new set of problems that we need to surmount and get ahead of. So where does AI go wrong? So this is kind of a busy diagram, and I'm not going to go through it, but it's actually, I have to give credit, it's available on a website called ethicalOS.org, or Ethical Operating System. And the guys there, and which is a great resource if you're interested in these topics, and it's got toolkits and lots of interesting things to read through. But they took this on as a challenge and tried to map out the different areas in which AI and new technologies are changing our kind of lived experience, changing our world as humans. And this might not be complete, but it's certainly a very good kind of mapping exercise. And we've got lots of different risk zones, as they call them there. I don't want to talk through these individually, although, again, if you're interested, I would really suggest digging in. I want to give some examples of what we mean when we talk about some of the ethical concerns surrounding AI. And I'm going to jump with the first one first, which you probably heard about, these ideas of algorithmic bias or systems that discriminate. And as we said before, we work with systems that are built by humans, and we all have biases and we all have skewed ways of looking at the world because our experiences are limited to our experiences. And as I said just previously, the data that we collect and we use to power lots of AI systems isn't necessarily representative of the world. It's a selection rather than an exhaustive representation. And often data that we used, I mean, it necessarily is from the past, right? And over time, things change. And sometimes data that we use to make decisions is representative of a different time or kind of historical, social, political context. And I hope this example makes it a bit clearer, and you may well be familiar with this one already. It's from a year ago. Amazon decided to use their very smart people to build an algorithm that would look at resumes and decide who would be the perfect Amazon employee. And so it took the last 10 years of Amazon employees who'd done really well at the firm, and it built a model of the perfect Amazon employee. And they thought, this is it. This is the holy grail. We're going to put 100 candidates' resumes through this system, and it's going to spit out the top 5, and we're going to hire them. And they're going to be, this is the best way to find great employees. But there's a problem, is when you look at the resumes of the last 10 years of Amazon employees, they have, let's say, some commonalities. I mean, this is a tech firm, guys, on the West Coast. And actually, a hell of a lot of former employees were men. And so what did the system learn? It learned that the best employees for a business like Amazon are men. And it actually started penalizing the resumes of women and basically casting them aside and elevating the resumes of men just because they were men. And these are resumes where the names had been redacted or taken off, and they've been trying to eliminate things that indicated gender. But this system was good, and it would find in your hobbies, if you'd been the member of the women's chess club, not good for a job, eliminated. If you'd gone to an all-female college, it learned that. It learned that that was a proxy for your gender, eliminated. And luckily, those working on it figured this out. They got ahead of this, and they say they never use the system, and we must take them at their word. But they decided to try to fix it, to try to get rid of these kind of proxies for gender. And in the end, they thought, we just can't do this. We can't be 100% positive that this system isn't going to discriminate. And so they got rid of it, which is great, right? That they knew, and they got ahead of it, and it was never used. But the problem is, as I see it, and a lot of other people see it, is what other systems like this are out there in the wild right now, taking these kinds of discriminatory decisions, not just on gender, it could be on race and ethnicity, on age, on a variety of factors that you can find out quite easily from someone's resume, even when the information is taken away, the kind of demographic information is removed, you can kind of work it out. And that's worrying. We need to think about this, and this isn't about people using these things deliberately and perniciously. It's people just trust the technology and they believe that it's neutral, and it's not. Another, just sweeping ahead, another area that is really important area for AI and ethics is data control and surveillance. And we think a lot about facial recognition when we think about surveillance, but another area that I think is super interesting, especially at the moment, because a lot of people are working from home, is the ways in which employers are surveilling their employees, and a lot more now at home, as I say, but they've been doing it anyway for quite some time. This is from USA Today, and it comes from a report by Gartner, a big analyst company. And they estimated by 2020, so this is a report from the end of last year, and they thought by this year, about 80% of big businesses, so medium to large businesses actually, would be using some kinds of technology to monitor what their employees are doing. And so this is like, who's chatting with who? What kind of language are they using in Slack? Who are they emailing? How often are they emailing? What are they browsing on the internet? Who have they got appointments with in their calendars, and how long are those appointments? When do they seem to go idle? At what points in the day? And I think even more terrifyingly, if I may say so, some of these technologies, these kind of specific surveillance technologies, actually access the camera, and you can look this up, on devices in order to look at employees' faces and make determinations about their mood and their emotional state, using technologies that do that, which are disputed in and of themselves to a large degree. So why are they doing this? Why would a business do this? Well, firstly, it's about productivity. They want to make sure you're doing what you should be doing, and they're paying you for it, and they want to make sure you're paying attention and doing your job. But one of the reasons they give is that they want to assess how you are, making sure that you're happy and contented in your role. It used to be the case, and it still is in a lot of places, that they would send out an employee survey, and you would, fill in a survey and say what you thought about, your colleagues and your manager and the way the business was set up. But we all know, and this is true, what people say, especially when they're not sure if it's anonymous or not, and how people behave can kind of contradict one another. And so these big businesses are saying, look, we want to know if you're happy. So we're going to watch you, and we're going to look at your language and see if you're doing and saying things that tell us and convince us that you're okay, or help us work out if there's a problem and we need to fix it. Well, seems like a decent enough rationale to some people. But here is another technology that's being deployed in China, which says it does something with exactly the same rationale. So this is, and you can look at this, it's been disputed, but actually there's evidence that this is being used, which I don't know if you've heard of Elon Musk's Neuralink. There are these brain reading technologies now. It's a sensor that can sense the electrical impulses in your brain. And you can use systems to use those impulses to boil them down to emotional states. And so as it says here, the military and people who are at the helm of high-speed trains in China, they've been installing these sensors in helmets and using it to do exactly the same thing as the Gartner report says big businesses are doing here in America, which is understand whether people are happy, or if they're depressed, or if they're anxious, or if they're enthusiastic about their job. And the big question for all of us is this: there's nothing wrong with wanting employees to be happy, but what level of intrusion does it validate? Like, to what degree does that allow employers to really intrude on your personal space and your time and the interactions you have as humans? I don't have an answer for this, but it's a question that we all need to ask. Do the means justify the end? The last example I want to give is an area that I think is an interesting one, and I write about a lot for AI and ethics, is deception and inauthenticity. So this is the Prime Minister of the country that I'm from originally, Boris Johnson, who's Prime Minister of the UK. And this story came out at the end of last year, where a video emerged whereby Boris Johnson appeared to endorse at the time, his greatest political rival, the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, for Prime Minister. Has he gone mad? No. It is, and I'm sure many of you will be well familiar with these already. It's a deepfake video. It's a very convincing deepfake video. For those of you that aren't familiar with deepfakes, a deepfake is a video that has been amended with AI to show something happening that never happened in the real world. So in this case, they were able to put words in the mouth of the UK Prime Minister. But in other cases, you can have people do things they would never normally do, and so on and so forth. And it is an incredible deception. And increasingly, this technology is getting better. They're able to have deepfakes blink at the right cadence so they look human, because that's been an issue. Sometimes people will say, oh, we can tell that's a deepfake because it doesn't blink. And an even more granular level, there are people working to put pulses in necks of deepfakes to make them, again, look really, really human, as though there's blood flow underneath the skin as well. So increasingly, it seems to me that we're going into territory where we kind of fail to be able to recognize our own species, right? We don't know. They say seeing is believing. And we've trusted those senses for the whole of our human evolution. We've been able to trust in these senses that have guided us to where we are now. But not for the first time, but certainly this is the most aggressive assault on those kind of visual experiences and being able to identify other humans. And another example here, AI generated fake faces done, I believe, using GANs. These 6 people who look like 6 people to me do not exist. They are complete fabrications that were built by AI. And the idea is they would be used in advertising and things like that. But again, I would never know, and I defy any of you to tell me exactly what makes those people obviously non-human or not real. I think the lady with the red hair maybe has an earring in one ear and not the other, but you have to be looking pretty closely to notice some of the strange little flaws. So, as I say, we need to be looking out for deception and inauthenticity. But that's a lot, right? There's a lot of things coming at us all at the same time. And that's why I say we need to start thinking about ethics. Ethics is different to everyone. You might say, well, what I think is right and wrong is different to what my parents think is right and wrong, is different to where my family, who are from another culture and country, think is right and wrong, is different to, a different generation or people who live in a different socioeconomic context. And you're right. And that's why it's really difficult and why everybody's been thinking about this kind of thing for 2,000 years. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't. There are frameworks, and I'm not going to turn this into a philosophy class as much as I'd like to. But I want to walk through just one of the kind of fun and interesting frameworks, which is a way of using a mechanism to think about whether to do something or not, and how to evaluate that. Some of you will know this already, and I'm sure you're probably groaning at the sight of it. It's actually called the trolley problem, but I call it the infamous trolley problem because it tends to make people groan. But it's a good tool to start thinking about this. And actually thought about quite a lot in the context of autonomous vehicles. So here's the story, and I'll keep it as brief as I can. You're walking along the street and you see a trolley or a tram, depending where you're from, careening out of control, and you look and you see the driver is slumped over his wheel and he's passed out, and you look ahead and you can see 5 workmen working on the track, and they've got like ear defenders on and they're using pneumatic drills, and you are not going to be able to tell these guys to get out of the way. But then you look down and you see that there's a lever, and if you pull the lever, it's quite obvious to you that you can redirect the trolley onto another track, and there's only one guy there. Similar situation, ear defenders on, can't tell, you're never going to be able to alert this guy quick enough. So now you have to make a decision. Do you pull the lever or do you leave it? And I reckon that most of you listening now will have had an intuitive response to this. And having taught this little scenario in classes at colleges, I can tell you that whatever you think, someone else thinks that it's a no-brainer to do the exact opposite, because it tends to sit kind of around the 50-50 mark, what people think. Those of you who say, pull the lever, which actually was my first response when I first saw this, are taking a consequentialist approach. You're looking at the numbers and you're saying, well, 5 gets saved, 1 gets killed, we end up kind of with 4 on average left. It seems like the greatest good for the greatest number is to pull the lever, and unfortunately we have to dispose of this one guy, but we save the 5, and that's important. However, some others of you will have said, I don't want to pull the lever. I don't want to pull the lever and dispose of this poor guy who probably has a family and friends and people that love him and aspirations about what he wants to do in his life. I don't want to be responsible for that. I should just let nature take its course. And that's a perfectly legitimate view as well. You're thinking that this person shouldn't be an instrument, a kind of sacrificial lamb to save these other people. They're a valuable person in and of their own right, and that should be an important thing. There is no right answer, but we need to be thinking in at the very least these kinds of ways about what's important. The numbers one is kind of easier to understand. So for the non-numbers one, I wanted to show, and hopefully this works, a really quick video. Some of you might have seen this before. It's when Google launched Duplex, and this is at the developers conference, I think in San Francisco. And I'm going to play it so you can make your own assignations, but just to let you know before we watch it, the reaction in the room and the reaction on Twitter was very, very different. So let me play it and see what you think. Hopefully this volume or the sound works on this.
I don't think we can hear sound, so.
Oh, can you not hear?
Yeah, I think you might have to, in your screen share, you have to enable the sound.
Okay, I'm just going to describe what happens then. So this is an artificial assistant that can call a hairdresser's or a restaurant to make a reservation, or it can call a plumber. It's a voice assistant, so that can proactively ring out. So imagine Alexa, and it sounds really, really realistic. He plays a cue and it rings up and it says, "Hello, can I make a hair appointment for my boss?" And it makes like verbal intonations like and everybody's laughing because this virtual assistant sounds exactly like a real human being. And everyone in the audience, after the CEO plays the clip, is whooping and hollering because they're excited, because this is something new and different. It feels like we've created something that feels like and sounds like a human being. And it's smart and it's reactive. And think of all the people this could help, all the busy executives that this could take the burden of doing these kind of menial appointments and things like that away from them. Meanwhile, on Twitter, people were very angry because the fact that this assistant is so human-like in the way that it sounds on the telephone was deceptive. You know, they've deliberately tried to mislead the person on the other side of the phone, the person who works at the hairdresser's, who's making the appointment, you don't give them the dignity of even knowing that they're speaking to a machine and not a person. And it seemed to people that this was really unfair, that there were humans being duped. And if you think about who those humans often are, they're people on the lower end of the income scale who work in the service industries. And it felt to the Twitterverse, as it were, that this was really offensive, cruel thing to do to those people. It's the inauthenticity issue. It also implies that the people who use the technology can't possibly condescend to speak to somebody who works in a hairdresser's. We'll have a machine to do that instead. And so people got really mad because they wanted Google to acknowledge the dignity of the human worker on the other side of those calls. So that hopefully kind of sets up the kind of different ways of thinking about technology, because although this system could help lots and lots of people, it's also going to hurt others, or potentially could hurt others in a way that they don't even realize. So to finish, I think we've all got new responsibilities, not just technologists, but technologists. And I think they're doing great things. And there are lots of conversations happening about AI ethics in Silicon Valley, but also in other companies all around the world. But they're happening behind closed doors. Governments are thinking about this issue as well, and that's super important too. They are thinking about laws and regulations. And also academics are playing a really important role in advancing the field and thinking about how different technologies can affect people in different ways. But we can't let those three very elite pockets of society take decisions that affect us all without engaging with them. So, given we've got a young crowd, I'm asking you, be vigilant. Ask technologists to build trust and awareness through transparency. Look ahead and try to understand the risk factors associated with technology. Pick a problematic scenario. If you're thinking about AI, if you're working in a technical field or you want to work in a technical field, pick a problematic scenario. Think about how it could go wrong and how you could protect against that. And also, we should all be thinking as a society about what practical measures we can take now and on an ongoing basis to support a tech positive environment. I mean, this is, as I said at the beginning, it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as they say. It's not about getting rid of technology. It's about understanding how it fits and making sure it fits comfortably and safely into the societies and networks that we already have. So I love, and I don't need the sound for this. This is a cute little video that I'll let run in the background as I just say to you guys, and I'm aware we're going to do some questions, but just to say, you guys are in a really interesting position because you've been born into this context where technology is rapidly evolving, and I think you have a very, very interesting perspective on it. And so I implore you, where you're interested in AI, and I suspect the fact you're here means that you are interested in AI, to approach it with a healthy level of cynicism, especially consumer technologies that you're bringing into your own personal lives. Raise an eyebrow. We talk about trust in technology and it's important, but trust has got to be earned, and I'd be really gratified, and I think it's great that you guys are listening to me speak now, and we're at the early days, but it's for you guys to continue on these kinds of thoughts and conversations, but really do approach things, as I always say, with one eyebrow raised, and let that trust be earned. But yeah, I will finish there, and thank you very much, and take any questions.
Thank you again to Fiona for giving such a wonderful, thought-provoking talk. AI ethics is definitely an important topic to remember, especially for people who want to pursue the field of AI, regardless of whether you are in tech, education, or business. So this talk definitely helped to provide massive insight into that topic. As a reminder, if you would like to submit any questions, please use the Slido link provided below in the chat. And I actually do have one question myself. So Elon Musk in 2018 said, "Mark my words, AI is far more dangerous than nukes." There are many famous leaders today who also say the same. And what's your view of the future of AI? Will AI destroy the human mind? And what will we need to do, to heed in order to prevent this apocalyptic future?
I love this question, Melinda, and I get asked these kinds of things a lot, and it's the sort of thing I love thinking about. My tendency is to be less extreme than Elon, and not that I think it's hard to be more extreme than Elon sometimes. And I think, it is important. And as I say, I enjoy thinking about how this changes the human condition and what it means for us in the world. I mean, I was going to present a slide on, and just mindful of time, on GPT-3, which I'm sure a lot of you be familiar with, which is able to produce human language because it basically read the internet. I think its training data, I think the English speaking Wikipedia was 0.6% of its training data, and it can now create, articles and poetry and write code and things like that. And so I'm interested in how these things are going to kind of sideline us potentially, or kind of destroy our ability to do what we want when we want. But I actually think that the bigger issues are right in front of our noses, and are things like the Amazon example of discrimination and facial recognition technology, which has been proven to be much less effective on women of color, which is, highly problematic. And those kinds of near-term issues, which are causing certain sectors of society to not have an equal and fair experience based on the technologies that are being used. So am I worried about, the singularity and about an all-seeing, all-knowing AI monster taking over and destroying us all and turning us into, I think it was Steve Wozniak, Steve Jobs' partner at Apple, who said that we will be reduced to the status of the family pet as humans. But I don't worry about that as much as I worry. I mean, we have trouble building autonomous vehicles that can park themselves still at the moment. And so I think we need to be more realistic and thinking about where near-term problems arise.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. Looking at the closer problems to where we are now with AI is definitely going to be more helpful to helping us develop AI that might be more safe for human use, definitely. So looking at the Q&A chat, so the first question is, so since we as people have many different notions of ethics, so how in the future can we decide of what framework to give AI for different scenarios?
It's a really, really good question. And I think that's something that we're wrangling with at the moment. And to be honest, I don't have a good answer. But what is happening is people who work in the field directly, who work for tech companies doing the kinds of things that I talk about, are really trying to synthesize different ethical frameworks and bring in. So the example that I gave was a kind of consequentialist framework. That's what the Trolley Problem sort of speaks to. But there are incredible examples of ethical frameworks that come from Eastern philosophy, and ones that have been developed more in the more recent past, and ones that were developed, right back in the times of the ancient Greeks, that we can draw down upon centuries and millennia indeed of human thought in order to look in the round our technologies. And it's not going to be a one size fits all, because as I said earlier on, how you think of right and wrong and I think of right and wrong are different. But I think as human beings, we do have a sense in what things are off limits and what things really are wrong. I think most of us can agree that systems that discriminate based on ethnicity are wrong, right? So let's start there. And we can agree that things that are going to be deceptive and going to lead vulnerable people to put trust in things that they shouldn't trust are wrong. So let's think about that. And it feels non-scientific, but actually, there are some robust frameworks through which we can look at these things, and we're right at the very beginning. So I don't want to recommend a particular framework, but I think it's a case of kind of synthesizing what we know and what we can do, and getting to a place where the values of the technologies that companies put out into the world align with their company values.
Yeah, definitely. And it seems that the best way to use AI is to first aid in decision making for humans and then to expand their capabilities. Are there examples of this approach?
Oh, interesting. So you think that they should be an aid rather than just the kind of snapshot decision making on our behalf? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, basically, I think.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's interesting because I write about decision guidance systems as well. So these ideas, so thinking about your Netflix and, to a degree, your Google search results are somewhat bespoke to you and as are Google Maps and things like that. And I think there's a tendency to think of decision guidance systems as kind of supportive, and you have the option of kind of backing out and taking a different decision or getting information from elsewhere. But actually, we're becoming increasingly dependent even on the systems that merely make suggestions. We don't like to question their suggestions because we think, it has a lot of data and it's telling me something that probably is right. And the other side of that that I am particularly interested in is in our personal lives. If we only ever really see a section of the world through the internet that is handpicked and tailored for people like me. So if I get things suggested for me that are based on my previous browsing history, I never really get to see things that don't fit me. And actually, I'm interested in those things. What things don't you think I'd be, how do I ever branch out in terms of my character and my personality if I'm just shown the same old things all the time? It becomes quite static. And so if you believe, and I do in any way, that the decisions that you make, so how you wear your hair, where you go to school, what your favorite color is, where you like to go on vacation, whether you like animals or not, those decisions that you make about yourself are, I think, constitutive of who you are as a person. Like our choices are us, really. And if you are kind of openly allowing AI algorithmic systems to constantly kind of cultivate those choices for you, you're kind of handing over a little bit of yourself to the people who built those algorithms. And that strikes me as a little sad. And so although I think that decision guidance systems are less potent, I think we still need to be, mindful that, they aren't kind of shepherding us around the world, taking us to places that they want us to go rather than the places that we'd like to go.
Yeah, I feel like definitely that's a good point to make, because as AI algorithms become increasingly more potent, it's more and more likely that we'll become more dependent on these systems.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's something dangerous that we also have to keep in mind. And I feel like it's safe to keep on, just because it's our job to branch out, and by, like, as you said, by sort of leaving all this decision making to AI and becoming more dependent, we're sort of losing a part of ourselves in the process.
Yeah, I think so.
And another question. So do you think the future is one where all jobs or most jobs happen to be controlled by AI? And is it our responsibility to let this happen or stop it? Or is there another one?
That's a really good question, because it's such a thinker for me. Firstly, no, and this is my personal opinion. I don't think that all or most jobs are going to be done by AI. And I think that for a variety of reasons. Firstly, I feel like AI can do tasks, but to think that it can do all jobs misunderstands what a job is. Most jobs comprise of a variety of different tasks. And some of those tasks are uniquely human. Being able to make someone emotional or understand your point of view is actually something that is very difficult for a system, at least right now, to do. There are creative jobs, and look, I believe that AI can be creative, but I still believe that that's underpinned by humanity, because its meaning is in our eyes, as it were, and we want to see in creations of art, we like to see something of the lived experience. When you listen to music, you think about, you get emotional sometimes, or you whatever. It's difficult to have that relationship to a system. That said, I do think, and also, sorry, I'm just going back on the kind of no answer. I also believe that we as humans need work. As much as I would love, in theory, to be laid on a beach all day, every day, sipping a cocktail, I actually think that we need work. We like the challenge of work. We are productive creatures, and for that to be lifted away, at the same time as I was thinking, well, this is a burden, I think we kind of misread what work is to the human condition. That said, I do think that AI is going to take on more and more. And I'm hesitant to be kind of critical about that. And I don't want us to think that we have to intercept this, because not that long ago, we didn't have thermostats and people stoked fires and put it out. And now we don't have to think about the temperature so much anymore. And that's a good thing, right? Because I don't want to waste my day, getting coal out and starting a fire. And when they first recorded sound and music, people were like, oh my God, there's a great quote on the internet that you should look up. And there was a terrible tirade against it, because they said people would lose their singing voices and mothers would no longer sing to their babies, because now they've got this recorded music and that's going to happen instead. Did that happen? No. And so we have to temper our kind of outrage at the idea that AI is going to come and take things away by acknowledging sometimes it's good to have some things taken away, and that's fine. And there's lots of promise and positivity in some of the things that AI is able to do. So that's a long answer to the question, what about taking jobs? I think it's going to take some jobs, but I think we'll be surprised how few roles ultimately it takes on.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great answer to point out. I feel like a lot of people talk about how in the future, artificial intelligence is going to be the ultimate takeover. But I feel like it's going to be especially hard, especially now, for AI to actually take over the aspects of humanities that, like, as you said, emotional aspects that seem mostly human. And as we look at, as you pointed out with deepfakes, do you think AI is affecting the US presidential election?
Ooh, yeah. I think probably. I think it's inescapable now. And I think this has been one of the things that kind of frighten people quite often with technology. We don't kind of realize, we don't see the impact. Like, it's hard to anticipate how social media was going to have the impact that it's had, right? And so, now we're seeing the kind of reprisal of that, and people are now becoming more cynical about how it's used by political movements. And I think in the US, at least we are now, like, look, someone's asked that question. And so at least we're checking it, we're regulating it, we're trying to have conversations with people like Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and those that can control these ecosystems. My worry is actually beyond the US and where I'm from in the UK. There are various examples globally where things like Facebook advertising and algorithms that divide and conquer in terms of political audiences had been weaponized with, really quite questionable motivations behind them. So I think, we need to keep an eye and maybe let the US be a template for how it should be done and regulated throughout the rest of the globe. But I think it's an important question, and I don't have the answer, but we need to watch very, very closely.
Yeah, certainly, especially with how the recent debates about how Facebook should be managing their fact-checking policies. I feel like that's definitely going to play an important role in how AI is going to affect the US presidential election.
Yeah, that's it. And actually thinking about the jobs and whether jobs will go away, the role of moderator is going to become a really important, actually, it's going to become a professional job, I think, in my opinion, going into the future. There was never a proper role before. It was never a salaried job, but it's going to be. And so actually AI is kind of taking some jobs away, but creating new ones that we may never have thought of 10 years ago.
For sure. And do you think it's possible to create a bias-free AI system? And if not, what can we do to make sure that these biases are controlling our lives?
So it depends what you mean by a bias-free AI system. Do I think that we can let systems run unmonitored, without kind of human in the loop, and they remain bias free? I'm not sure. I think it's so important, and this is what we're learning, to have human beings, individuals involved in, especially where algorithms and AI systems are taking decisions that affect human beings in the world, which is, a lot of the time. We need to make sure that we are on a regular vetting and kicking the tires of these systems to ensure they align with our values, whatever we perceive them to be and whatever we decide them to be. I think it's really difficult to imagine a world, because bias and fairness are subjective things, and they mean different things in different contexts. And so I think we need to remain, as to my last slide, we need to remain vigilant. And unfortunately, I think that means that we can't just trust that a system is unbiased and let it roll in most scenarios.
Definitely, there needs to be some human supervision on that part. And how do you think AI can be used to improve the condition of people who are disadvantaged, especially like economically? And can AI increase the equality of opportunity?
Yeah, I think it can. And I think there's loads of potential. And it's not necessarily within my kind of scope as a writer, but it's nevertheless something I'm interested in as a person. And there are technologies that are doing incredible jobs, as particularly in, so a couple of examples of ways I think it's improving our lot as humans. I've written a little bit actually about how AI systems are helping those with disabilities. And I think the blind community have said, or there was an announcement made by one of the main bodies that represents the blind community in the US, and they said the iPhone, with all of its technology, is the biggest change in the lifestyle of those with visual impairments. It's been the biggest kind of progression since Braille, which is incredible, right? They can do a load of things, and they just have, this piece of kit. They don't have something that costs a fortune that they've always had to buy before in terms of expense and specialist technology. They can communicate exactly the same as everyone else does on the same platform, which is super important. Similarly, there are some incredible technologies out there for those with physical impairments that are AI enabled. And so I actually think that the future is really promising in that regard. And similarly, in terms of resources, you mentioned to make sure the world is equitable, and those who might be an economic disadvantage. There's lots of work being done by some really great organizations in developing countries, particularly, where I think it's interesting to do all sorts of things to improve the lot of the economy, from learning how to supercharge agriculture and make sure that crops yield and can deliver to the people who need in the local community, to governments using them to allocate resources in the most efficient way to make sure everybody gets what they're owed and their piece of government resource. So yeah, I think that's exciting. As I say, it's not my field, but it's one of those, look, everything is kind of night and day. And like that Paul Virilio quote I put up earlier, when you invent the plane, you invent the plane crash. And there are good and bad sides to all of these things. But for the most part, I do truly believe, despite my presentation, that AI is going to do some amazing things, and it's going to change the world for some of the people that we've just spoken about.
Yeah, for sure. You can never progress in society without having some cons to each progression. And especially with AI, it's helping to provide to many, like, as you said, low-income places in developing countries. Like, for example, I know this one organization, they're working to use AI to provide filtered water for the local communities, which is definitely something I think that couldn't be accomplished without AI. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to close with one more question. So for someone looking to read up more on AI and ethics, which fields would you recommend exploring? And any reading suggestions for the audience?
Wow, you come to the right place. There's a ton of stuff out there, and I'm happy to provide resources to you guys, and I can forward them on. Obviously, read my blog, youthedata.com, but and there are so there's a couple of places that are doing some really good work. The Berkman Klein Center is doing a lot of stuff. There's many of you will watch The Social Dilemma, the Center for Humane Technology. There's an organization called Data and Society, which is affiliated with NYU. They've got a great website and lots of resources. Oxford University do incredible stuff at the Oxford Internet Institute, and also the Centre for the Future of Humanity have some really interesting resources there. And also close to me, Santa Clara University have got some toolkits that are completely free to download, and they've been downloaded, I'm reliably informed, by people in something like 26 different countries all over the world. That speak to these ethical frameworks that I mentioned, and sort of reasonable ways of looking at technologies that take us through a process, so we're not making kind of emotional decisions about whether something is bad or good. We're using our human reason to get from one place to the other.
Thanks again for giving such a wonderful talk. Any final words?
No, it's just fantastic to speak to young people. And if any of you ever are interested in writing, I take guest posts on my blog, You the Data, so please do submit, and feel free to drop me a line about anything else if this is a field you're interested in. I'm always delighted to hear from people.
Sounds amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to hand it over to Jeffrey to close.
All right. So I guess thanks everyone for coming to this talk. We realize this is on the weekend, so we just appreciate your commitment to learning about AI. Also, Fiona, if you would mind just sending us a link to maybe some of the resources you listed. And after this talk, we'll be sure to send everyone who signed up for the talk a list of some of these resources if you're interested in learning more after hearing today's talk. So with that, I would just like to end. Thank you, Fiona, and everyone, just have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.